Hi, welcome to Module 6. Module 6 roughly corresponds with Chapter 6 of your textbook, Building the American Republic, but we're really focusing on the first half of that chapter and the revolution within. So we're exploring what liberty came to mean for various communities, and especially how did African Americans, free and enslaved, as well as elite white women, come to use the language and the ideas of the revolution to make their own demands for liberty. And when we think about understanding what liberty came to mean for various communities, we're also going to be looking at suffrage, religious toleration, and competing ideas about economic freedom or economic liberty. You have a couple of assessments, of course, tiny test on Remember the Ladies, a letter from Abigail Adams to her husband, John. You've already completed part 1, looked at liberty in the air. And after this lecture, you'll be able to take your Module 6 lecture exit exam. So you've already done Module 6 part 1 with slavery and the making of America. Today, we're going to focus on those debates over suffrage, religious toleration, and economic liberty. We're going to talk about the effect of the revolution on women's lives, and we're going to explore the changing nature of gender and family during and after the revolution, specifically the idea of Republican motherhood, which you will be able to define after this module. Okay, so let's talk first about suffrage, the right to vote. During the revolution, the idea of democracy is changing. Now, most American patriots, the elite patriots like Washington and Hamilton especially, still believe in small r republicanism, the idea that only people with economic security, only people that own property should be in politics. They still believe in the idea of deference, that regular working class people should defer to their betters in political matters. But through this expansion of political participation that we saw in the last module, through all of those public protests, even riots, through participation in the committees of safety, and through military service, we're seeing that regular Americans, what we would call working class people, during and after the revolution, demand the right to vote based on their political participation, not on property qualifications. And we're going to see that struggle in several state constitutions. So in 1776, John Adams says to the 13 independent colonies, all right, write your own state constitutions. A constitution is basically how a government is run. That's what a constitution is. It says how the government will function. And in 1776, we see some really democratic constitutions. By far, the most democratic is the 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution and the 1784 New Hampshire Constitution. Let's look at the Pennsylvania Constitution to understand what I mean when I say this is a really democratic constitution. All right. First of all, why is Pennsylvania so radical? Because that's where the most radical revolutionaries live and hang out, mostly in Philadelphia, where you have people like Thomas Paine thinking and writing in Philly. Benjamin Rush, who is a proponent of education for boys and girls, Thomas Young, and people like Benjamin Franklin. Benjamin Franklin is, along with Sam Adams, one of the more radical revolutionaries. Ben Franklin, for instance, is one of the only founding fathers who actually believes in abolishing slavery. So they're in Philadelphia creating this hotbed of radicalism for Pennsylvania, and they contribute to the Pennsylvania Constitution. What does it do? Creates low-cost schools for boys and girls, enshrines freedom of speech and religious toleration, that you could practice whatever religion you wanted in Pennsylvania. Some of this also comes from a Quaker influence. We'll talk about the Quakers later, but they're actually, I don't think we will. So they're a more radical Protestant religion that believes, for instance, in racial and gender equality. Okay. This religious toleration, though, did not extend to office holding. So you didn't have to be a Christian to vote. You could practice your religion as you see fit, but the religious test of the 1776 Constitution does disbar Jewish men, because to become a elected official, you had to swear, quote, "I do believe in God, the creator and the governor of the universe, the rewarder of the good and the punisher of the wicked, and I do acknowledge the scriptures of the Old and New Testament to be given by divine inspiration." Jewish men could not attest that they acknowledged the New Testament as divine inspiration. So that religious test actually kept Jewish men out of office. Okay, but how is it, understanding that important caveat, how is it the most democratic of the constitutions? Well, it removed the requirement to own property, one. So you no longer had to own property, a certain amount of money or a certain amount of lands to be able to vote. Now, this opens the vote to most free white men in Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania does not extend the right to vote to women. So again, that democratic nature is limited, but it's still the most democratic. And how else is it more democratic? It eliminates the executive branch. In 1776 in Pennsylvania, there's no governor. Now you understand this constitution has changed. Pennsylvania has a governor now. In 1776, it did not. No governor and no upper house. Instead of two houses, it had a unicameral legislation, a single house. To think about or understand how that leads to a more democratic state, let's imagine that our US Constitution was the 1776 Pennsylvania Constitution. We would have no executive branch, no president, and no upper house, no Senate. What we would have instead is a single body, House of Representatives, making all of the decision, making all of the laws. If you did not like the decisions they were making, if you lived in San Antonio, you would call up Lloyd Doggett and complain to him. That's as high up as it goes. Lloyd Doggett and his fellow congressmen in the House of Representatives would be the only body making decisions. This means that your access to that decision making is much closer. It goes you, Lloyd Doggett, decision making. There's no Senate, there's no Ted Cruz, right? There's no president. So in that way, not just could more people vote, but their votes were more powerful. They're voting directly for in Pennsylvania, they're voting directly for their local representatives to make all of the decisions. Conservative patriots, Whigs, don't get attached to these parties. They're not going to stick around very long. But conservative patriots in the Whig parties still distrusted this idea of majority rule. And they really rejected the abolition of property qualifications for voting and office holding. Not just voting, but holding office. People that weren't wealthy, people that weren't economically independent holding office. Conservative Whig John Adams reacted with horror to the Pennsylvania Constitution. He said that it was, quote, so democratical that it must produce confusion and every evil work, end quote. In his mind and the mind of other conservative Whigs like Washington and Hamilton, this Constitution put way too much power into the hands of men who they thought had no business exercising the right to vote or holding office. They still believed in that idea of deference, that these people shouldn't be holding office. If they can vote, they should be electing us to hold office, but we don't really trust them to vote in the first place. You see John Adams' interpretation in the Massachusetts Constitution. John Adams wrote most of the Massachusetts Constitution, and it reflects his fear of too much democracy. It has two legislative chambers, upper and lower house, and it has a strong governor with broad veto powers. Adams wanted someone at the top to be able to veto any of those ideas. So the lower house has ideas, those ideas have to get filtered through the upper house, which may shut them down, which has to get sent up to the governor, who may shut them down. Like South Carolina, Massachusetts put in place office holding requirements. So the governor had to have an estate worth at least $1,000, a phenomenal amount of money. To serve in the state Senate, a man had to own an estate worth at least $300, and have at least $600 in total wealth. You had to be very wealthy. To vote, someone had to own or be worth at least $60. 60 pounds, I should say. There's no dollars yet, but I'm just going to say dollars because that's what we understand. Money, they had to have wealth. Judges are appointed, not elected. And that is, again, to keep that democracy in check. Some northern states, though, I shouldn't say some, one northern state, though, New Jersey, they still had property qualifications in New Jersey. So in that way, it was much less democratic than Pennsylvania, which had no property qualifications. But Pennsylvania said no property qualifications, you just have to be a free man. New Jersey says you just have to have some wealth, which meant that wealthy widows in New Jersey could vote until 1807. So we see, rightly, property qualifications as anti-democratic. But in that anti-democratic space, it created opportunities, for instance, for women to vote. So it's a little bit complicated. And by the way, yes, those women in New Jersey are going to be very upset in 1807 when they lose the right to vote. The southern states, though, are the least democratic. Maryland and South Carolina are good examples. Maryland's 1776 Constitution restricted office holding to the wealthy planter class. Planters are not farmers. Planters, think huge estates, enslavers owning these huge estates and enslaved people doing the agriculture. Planters are different than farmers. And of course, there are some farmers in the South. So in the South, the planter class ruled firmly. They were very undemocratic in that regard. You had to have $5,000 worth of wealth to be a governor. That's astronomical. You had to have $1,000 of personal property to be a senator in the Maryland State Senate. This really created in the South a top planter class, an aristocracy that's going to maintain power, even as in the South, the right to vote will gradually open for white men. Okay. That's suffrage. People are clamoring, and Pennsylvania responds to that people are demanding. My political participation means I get to vote even if I don't own property. We see that take hold in the North much more firmly than in the South. So we're starting to already see some sectional differences there. Let's talk about religious toleration. Again, the North is going to have a lot more need for religious toleration simply because of the pluralism of the North, that there is a much more diverse religious population. Here we have a city of New York, and you can see all of the religious houses. You can look down here to see that we have Baptists and Catholics and Protestants, that there's a Jewish synagogue, a New Scots meeting. I have no idea what the New Scots are. You've got Quakers, you've got Calvinists, Anabaptists, Moravians, Lutherans, Methodists. You got a little bit of, well, mostly Christian sects, but you also see that you do have that synagogue. So this emerges, religious toleration emerges out of a need for it. There's a really diverse religious population. And when we think about separation of church and state, that is, of course, going to be enshrined in the US Constitution when we get to that in the next module, we understand that deists, of course, most of our founding fathers are deists. They believe in that watchmaker God who's somewhere else, not here. And they're Enlightenment thinkers, so they're critical of the relationship of a united church and state. So we understand, of course, that these deists, these Enlightenment thinkers are going to advocate for a separation of church and state. But we should also understand that likewise, these diverse religious populations, including evangelical sects that had arisen out of the Great Awakening, they also wanted separation of church and state, because separation of church and state would both shield the state from religious corruption and shield churches from state corruption. So this was Americans were really unified on this issue of church and state for different reasons. All right, so most states disestablished their churches. That does not mean that they canceled them, but they were not supported by public funds. There's not going to be a specific church in Pennsylvania that is supported by public funds. And think about it, if you're a Quaker in Pennsylvania, you don't want your taxes to go to the Anglican church, right? So you're going to say, yes, I want separation of church and state. I don't want to pay taxes to support a church that I don't go to. All right, we got suffrage, we got religious toleration, economic equality. This is going to be a big one. The Enlightenment, this idea that you can understand the watch, you can understand the whole universe, that human beings are capable of understanding all natural phenomena, influenced the birth of modern economic ideas. And we see that really clearly in Adam Smith's, Wealth of Nations, published in 1776. Smith is an Enlightenment thinker. And so he believed that economics, like everything, economies must be a natural phenomena, capable of regulating themselves if left alone, hands off. Laissez-faire literally means hands off. What is the mechanism for regulation if we're hands off? Competition. Smith believed that competition would lead to an economy, a growth of wealth for everyone. That's something that sometimes gets lost in our understanding of Smith. He says laissez-faire is going to make everyone wealthier. How? The mechanism of competition would create a nation of small producers competing with each other to keep quality high and prices low. He says this competition is going to prevent any single producer from becoming too large. Adam Smith is going to be used to justify massive corporations in the Gilded Age, History 1302, like U.S. Steel. But Smith, now I'm thinking about Gilded Age, but let's go back. No, back to 1776. He says, no, the competition is actually going to prevent the growth of these large corporations, and it's going to prevent monopolies. And consumers would use that competition to play producers off of each other to keep prices fair. Here's how that would work. Let's use a flour mill as an example. So you go down to the Pioneer Flour Mill down on the south side, and suddenly the price of flour has raised. The price of flour has gone up. Well, you go down the street to the King Arthur Flour Mill and see if they have a lower price. If so, all of the business goes to King Arthur. The Pioneer Flour Mill is forced to either lower their price or justify their higher price by pointing out better quality, right? But what if there's only one flour mill? What if flour becomes scarce? The price is going to go up if it becomes scarce. But the wild card in Adam Smith, good Lord, the wild card in Smith's imagined process is, of course, people. When food is scarce, people tend to riot. Now, Smith's ideas are really influential among elite Americans, especially those closely associated with the Enlightenment, but they contradict common folks' ideas of fair pricing, which had been for generations, for hundreds of years, been maintained by guilds setting prices, but also by local courts and magistrates enforcing fair prices. So regular folk, what we would call working class people, have an expectation that if prices get too high, the courts, the magistrate would be on their side and demand lower prices. They have these ideas that, or tradition tells them, look, price controls are one of the ways that you keep the price, especially of food, fair. And this wild card, this contradiction of ideas of what economic liberty means, were on clear display during the Revolution. Between 1776 and 1779, fair prices were enforced by riots over 30 times. Food shortages caused more than 30 food riots as angry men and women accosted merchants who hoarded, overcharged from their view, or monopolized coffee, tea, sugar, and of course, flour. In a lot of these food riots, women led, because women are traditionally the people that are in charge with provisioning their households. And they would attack otherwise patriotic merchants. And here's how it would work. If the Pioneer and the King Arthur are both have too high prices, or if Pioneer's the only mill in town and the price has gotten really high, these women would go, they would tell the merchant the fair price that they believed in. They would say, this is the fair price for flour. They would pay that fair price and they would seize the flour. And they fully expected, and most of the time they were right, they fully expected that courts and magistrates would side with them because that's what tradition dictated. And you can see this is absolutely contradictory to Smith's idea of free trade. We're going to encounter these contradictions again in later modules. This is not something that is resolved during the Constitution or during the Revolution. Of course, this is a fundamental question in American history that we still talk about. What does economic liberty or freedom actually entail? All right. And today, of course, we talk a lot about monopolies. Again, with Adam Smith's with the idea of competition. Well, what happens if the Pioneer flour mill buys the King Arthur flour mill, and now there's only one flour mill everywhere in America, right? Now you have a monopoly. Okay, stick around for 1302. Just pay attention to the news for more on monopolies. Let's, come on, buddy, let's go. There we go. So we got suffrage, religious toleration, economic liberty. Let's turn to women and the revolution. And how did the revolution change subtly but significantly women's roles in American society and American politics? You know already that women participated in the revolutionary debate at home and in public through reading, writing, fashion, creating homespun garments. You could see here that a patriotic woman has made a fabulous embroidery of freedom. She's stepping on chains down here. This is a young woman who's decorated her journal with revolutionary slogans, liberty or death. So you already know from previous modules the ways that women, wealthy, free, unfree, non-wealthy, all participated in the revolution. Women also participated in the Revolutionary War in significant ways. For wealthy women, ladies' associations helped to raise money for the Continental Army. All women were engaged in that, or all patriots were engaged in that patriotic consumption, buying American made, making your own so you don't have to buy British goods, in that homespun movement. Women around the country were left to manage homes, businesses in the South, plantations, as their husbands left for war. But the poorest women, women who had no business to manage, imagine that you're a poor woman, your husband leaves for the army, you're not going to be able to sustain yourself. He's not getting paid yet. And we'll get into that in the next module. So what are you going to do? You're going to pick up and you're going to follow him. Camp followers are both the wives and children of many of the poor soldiers, but they also were instrumental in running things because there was not the military organization yet to have laundry done, to have food repaired, to have injuries cared for, to have uniforms sewed up when they were damaged. The camp followers did all of that. Washington hates them. List of things that Washington hates. Let's add like too many people voting, the wrong people voting. But he also hates the camp followers. Why? Because they slow his army down. He's always complaining about them. These camp followers are slowing the army down. And they did, of course, but they were also necessary to running the army. He also became suspicious when many of his officers, so wealthier men, would have their wives come into the camp in winter to stay with them. And Washington believed that most camp followers were prostitutes. They absolutely were not, but he would become suspicious when an officer, like one year, would bring his wife. The next year, same officer bring a woman, and Washington's like, is that the same wife you had last year? And the officer was like, and it was not. So Washington's very suspicious of these camp followers. Women also worked as spies, in part because they weren't expected to be spies, so they could really fly under the radar there. And at least a few women camp followers. They're there for that reason. Well, we have one or two, of course, that become famous for dressing up as men and enlisting in the army. But one or two women become famous for picking up their husband's arms and continuing the fight after they fall. Now, this is both a potentially true story about a woman named Molly Pitcher. You see her depicted here in the secondary source from later. Molly Pitcher, who mans the cannon after her husband dies. That may have happened, but Molly Pitcher comes to encapsulate as this myth, comes to encapsulate all of the work that women did to assist the army. So this myth making of the Molly Pitcher is a way that people understood women's efforts during the war, whether or not there was actually ever a real woman named Molly Pitcher. If you want to, you can look that up and see what evidence exists for and against. All right. So how does the revolution change the status of women? In many ways, it doesn't. Their official legal status, here we're largely talking about elite women, by the way, which means largely elite white women. Their legal status does not change. They are still under this idea of coverture. Coverture is the idea that a woman is legally represented first by a father, or another male relative, then by a husband. If there's no male relatives to be found, then by a lawyer who keeps her estate in trust. This idea that then is that women as legal entities don't exist. They are covered by the men in their lives. That persists. You're going to read Abigail Adams' letter to her husband, John, asking that women attain legal status, that their status is changed in the country. I also encourage you to look up John's reply and read the full reply. Some things do change. Some states grant divorce. Of course, Pennsylvania. This is New England. I almost certainly, New Hampshire grants divorce. The bar is still very high. You still need male relatives to attest in court to your need to divorce, but it becomes possible. What changes, though, is that women learn, like Abigail Adams, women learn to use the language of the revolution to advocate for themselves and for an expansion of their own rights. What that is going to look like is encapsulated in what historians call Republican motherhood. Republican motherhood is how historians understand the change in especially elite women's roles in politics and in society. Legal status doesn't change, but this new idea of Republican motherhood politicizes elite women's roles as wife and as mother. So let's look at what were the gender or family ideals that existed before the revolution, and how did they change in subtle ways? So let's look at the old thing first. The old thing, the pre-revolutionary ideal. Now it's an ideal, so not everyone, lives quite that way. And again, we're talking about elite people here. We're talking about wealthy people. Republican motherhood takes this idea, this pre-revolutionary idea, and changes it in important ways. But what we're not talking about here is Republican motherhood eradicating older ideas and replacing them. Rather, it's going to give them new meaning. So again, let's see what the older ideal is. The old gender ideal, pre-revolutionary, and we're talking in England, in France, in Germany, in America, is this idea of keep within compass. The idea of keep within compass was that men and women had complementary roles that completed each other to make a whole, complementary spheres in which they existed. Now, keep in mind, this is wealthy elites. So when we're talking about women being at home, the home, the estate is really the center of life for both men and women. So understand here that the sphere is very large for both of them. But here we have a woman whose job, she's got her this is probably her book to keep track of the budget of her estate. Her husband here is probably going to, he runs the estate as well, right? That's his business. But he also leaves to go in England to Parliament, in Virginia to the House of Burgesses to represent his family politically, right? In a way that she doesn't. He leaves, goes out to the world to represent them politically and economically. But they both have to keep within their spheres or bad things will happen. What are the bad things that will happen? Here we have her reading a novel, terrible, drinking and carousing, falling into poverty, and ending up at a poorhouse. Her husband may begin drinking and carousing with another woman. That will lead directly to a shipwreck. Seems sensible, and also to the poorhouse or to jail. So the idea was you keep within compass your complementary roles, or bad things will happen. I also want to point out that this is also on a teapot. Keep within compass teapot's my second favorite piece of material history in our class. This ideal does not stress motherhood. What this relationship is largely economic. That's not to say no husbands and wives loved each other, but these marriages among elites are largely to consolidate wealth. That what she is responsible for is keeping herself virtuous, running the household, and learning skills like embroidery, piano playing, painting, things to help entertain others. Mothering, having children is her role to keep the line, to keep the family going. But mothering children is not really a central part of her role. She pays nannies and tutors to do that at home. So this doesn't stress motherhood. This works just fine under a monarchy. But without a king to keep people in line, a king or a queen, how are you going to create generations of good citizens? And for this woman, maintaining her purity, embroidering nice things and playing the piano, it isn't really going to get the job done when it comes to creating generations of good citizens. So in revolutionary places like America first and France, and eventually in England, this idea of Republican motherhood is going to take hold. And what it does is it keeps women in the domestic sphere, but it expands the meaning of that domestic sphere. The importance of that domestic sphere becomes political. Motherhood becomes political. So in that absence of monarchy, you create good citizens by raising them that way. And it becomes the obligation of fathers and mothers to instill in their children virtuous ideas to make them a good citizen. So mothers and motherhood become central to the virtue and the stability of this new republic in America. Note also here that the depictions become more natural, closer, styles are looser. This looks very fancy, and anyone who's had long hair knows that this took a lot of time to create. But what it suggests to you, especially, it's a lot different than her giant wig and her giant outfit. What it suggests is a more natural, loose style that actually evokes the styles of ancient Greece and ancient Rome very intentionally. And you can see here that she's painted close with her children. Her dress is really like at the edge of her shoulder. There's a suggestion here that it could slip down. This is not to titillate viewers, but rather to suggest that she might be breastfeeding. Breastfeeding becomes in vogue. Breastfeeding falls in and out of fashion over time. Here we have a moment where it's in fashion for women to breastfeed their children rather than to hire a wet nurse. So it doesn't just politicize motherhood. It gives women a way to argue for their own educational needs. Consider this. She needs to know how to read. She needs to know how to do some math to keep the books, but she doesn't need to read Thomas Paine or John Locke. She doesn't need to be able to discuss the philosophies of Mary Wollstonecraft. She does. She needs to be able to discuss them and understand them so that she can instill them in her children. So this gives women a way to advocate for female education, including colleges. And we see a rise in women's colleges after the revolution. It also influences marriage, and it influences this idea of a companionate marriage. Companionate marriage is our ideal in 2021. It's the idea that you should marry someone not just for economic reasons, but because you respect them, because you want to spend time with them, and often in America, because you share their politics as well. But you want to marry someone that you believed to be intelligent, right? You don't want to marry someone that you can't have a conversation with. So it influences marriages. Now, wealthy people still marry among themselves to consolidate wealth, but it gives a new meaning to what that marriage requires. John and Abigail Adams are actually a really good example of a companion at marriage. She's his closest political advisor. He doesn't always take her suggestions, but throughout his presidency, she's one of his closest advisors. And she's also given a lot of credit for instilling a love of politics in her son, John Quincy Adams, who's also becomes the US president. All right. And so families become smaller, fewer children, households become smaller in the North as unfree labor fades away, households become smaller. And depictions of families, again, here you see very natural depiction, children behaving like children, mother's focus is entirely on her children. It's only the father who's looking straight at the viewer. Grandpa here is also staring off. And of course, our little girl is looking straight at the viewer as well. All right, next module, we're going to move on into emerging political parties. Then those political parties, those conflicts are going to emerge right at the Constitutional Convention. So that's next. Thanks always for listening and have a wonderful day.